The ship with two worlds. When RMS Titanic sailed from Southampton on April 10, 1912, she was not merely the largest moving object ever built by humans, she was a floating system of carefully controlled separation. Every corridor, staircase, doorway, and passage served a precise function, not only for engineering efficiency but for social order. Titanic was designed as a ship of worlds within worlds. First class, second class, third class, and beneath them all, a vast hidden network where the ship truly lived and breathed. This unseen domain belonged to the crew. While passengers admired grand staircases, chandeliers, and luxury cabins, nearly half of the people aboard Titanic existed almost entirely out of sight, moving through narrow steel corridors, service tunnels, and vertical shafts that few passengers ever knew existed. Among these forgotten routes was a particular crew passage, sealed, undocumented in public decks, and largely inaccessible even during early exploration of the wreck, a door whose purpose remained unclear for more than a century. Titanic carried approximately 2,224 people on her maiden voyage. Of these, more than 900 were crew members. They were firemen, trimmers, greasers, engineers, stewards, cooks, bakers, electricians, cleaners, and mess attendants. Their lives unfolded not in staterooms but below the waterline, where the air was thick with coal dust, steam, oil, and constant vibration. The ship's operational heart was buried deep within her steel body, and to keep that heart functioning, the crew relied on an internal circulation system entirely separate from the passenger experience. This network of corridors allowed food to move from galleys to dining rooms, linens to be replaced silently at dawn, coal to be shoveled continuously into roaring furnaces, and emergency instructions to be carried rapidly from one compartment to another. It was efficient, invisible, and intentionally hidden. Titanic's blueprints reveal over a dozen service staircases, dozens of watertight doors, and countless narrow passageways connecting compartments across 10 decks. Some were clearly labeled: crew only, engine room access, boiler uptake trunk. Others were not labeled at all. These unlabeled passages existed because Titanic was designed first and foremost as a working machine. Comfort was layered on top of that machine, but beneath the luxury was a ship that required constant human movement to survive. The forgotten crew passage that would later intrigue historians was part of this machine, not a secret in the conspiratorial sense, but forgotten because it was never meant to be remembered by passengers. To understand why this passage matters, it is necessary to understand how strictly Titanic enforced separation. First-class passengers lived almost entirely above the waterline, forward and midship, with access to promenade decks, lounges, and dining saloons. Second-class passengers occupied simpler but still comfortable spaces. Third-class passengers, many of them immigrants, were housed lower, toward the stern and bow, with limited access to upper decks. Crew spaces existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Crew slept in small shared cabins, often near the areas where they worked, and navigated the ship through routes that bypassed passenger corridors entirely. These routes were not optional. They were essential to maintaining the illusion that Titanic operated effortlessly. On the night of April 14, 1912, when Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., this hidden world was activated instantly. While many passengers remained unaware of the collision for several minutes, crew members deep inside the ship felt it immediately. Firemen in boiler rooms 5 and 6 heard and felt the scraping of ice against the hull. Engineers in the reciprocating engine room saw gauges fluctuate. Electricians monitored power systems as water began flooding compartments. Communication moved through crew passages, shouted orders, running footsteps, slammed watertight doors. The ship's survival for more than 2 hours after impact was not accidental. It was the result of crew members using this internal network to delay flooding, maintain power, and coordinate evacuation. Yet not all passages were equal. Some were well documented because they were used constantly. Others were rarely used, serving specific functions under specific conditions. The passage that would later be called forgotten falls into this second category. It was located deep within the ship's midsection, below passenger decks, near service areas that connected the engine casing to crew quarters and storage compartments. Contemporary deck plans hint at its existence, but descriptions are vague, and early survivor testimonies make no direct mention of it. This absence is not surprising. In 1912, no one thought to record the layout of crew-only corridors for historical purposes. These spaces were considered unimportant, even disposable. After Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the ship disappeared into darkness nearly 3,800 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic. For 73 years, Titanic remained lost. When Robert Ballard and his team discovered the wreck in 1985, they revealed a ship broken but still hauntingly intact. Initial exploration focused on iconic areas: the bow, the grand staircase opening, the bridge, and the first-class cabins. Over time, attention expanded to engineering spaces, boiler rooms, engine components, cargo holds. Crew passages, however, remained largely unexplored. The reason was simple. They were narrow, collapsed, flooded with debris, and often blocked by fallen bulkheads. Remotely operated vehicles prioritized large, visually identifiable spaces over confined tunnels with limited maneuverability. As exploration technology improved in the late 1990s and early 2000s, researchers began mapping Titanic in greater detail. High-resolution sonar scans revealed corridors and voids previously unseen. It was during these surveys that anomalies appeared: rectangular voids behind intact bulkheads, suggesting enclosed spaces not yet accessed. One such void aligned with an area that did not correspond neatly with known passenger or engine spaces. Archival deck plans suggested a service passage in that location, but no expedition footage showed it being entered. The doorway leading to it appeared intact, closed, and partially obscured by sediment and collapsed structure. It was not locked in the dramatic sense. It was sealed by circumstance, pressure, and decay. The phrase, "the door no one ever opened until now," must be understood carefully. No one in 1912 recorded opening it because no one thought it mattered. No diver physically opened it for decades because doing so was dangerous, technically complex, and scientifically low priority. Titanic exploration has always balanced curiosity against preservation. Every intrusion risks accelerating decay. Cutting through steel or forcing doors can destabilize surrounding structures. For this reason, many interior spaces remain untouched even today. When researchers eventually approached this particular passage, it was not out of sensationalism, but because advances in micro-ROVs and fiber optic cameras finally made non-invasive entry possible. What they found was not treasure, not a hidden room, not evidence of conspiracy. What they found was something far more revealing. A perfectly ordinary crew passage, frozen in time, filled with everyday objects that spoke quietly but powerfully about the people who lived and worked there. Enamel mugs, broken lamps, pipes running along the ceiling, hooks where uniforms once hung. The passage showed signs of heavy use: worn deck plating, scuffed walls, indicating that it had been vital during the ship's operation. This was not a forgotten space because it was unimportant. It was forgotten because history chose to remember luxury instead of labor. Understanding this passage reshapes how Titanic is remembered. The disaster is often told through the lens of class disparity, heroism, and tragedy. But the physical structure of the ship itself tells a parallel story, one of compartmentalization, efficiency, and invisible work. The crew passage illustrates how the ship functioned minute by minute. It shows how food reached tables, how orders traveled, how emergencies were managed. It reminds us that Titanic was not just a stage for human drama, it was a working industrial system pushed to its limits. In the next part, we will examine who specifically used this passage, how different crew roles intersected within it, and what survivor accounts indirectly reveal about its use during the final hours. We will also explore how the ship's design philosophy made such passages essential, and how that same philosophy contributed to the chaos when the system began to fail. WHO walked these corridors. To understand the significance of Titanic's forgotten crew passage, it is essential to understand the people who depended on it. The crew of Titanic was not a single unified group moving under one set of conditions. It was a hierarchy of labor, divided by function, status, and physical proximity to danger. Each role intersected with the ship differently, and the crew passage acted as a point of convergence where these lives briefly overlapped. Unlike passenger corridors, which were designed for comfort and aesthetics, crew passages were designed for speed, efficiency, and endurance. The individuals who walked these corridors did so not for leisure, but because the ship demanded constant human motion to remain alive. At the lowest levels of the ship were the firemen and trimmers, some of the most physically exhausted men aboard. Firemen worked in brutal shifts inside boiler rooms where temperatures often exceeded 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Their task was to shovel coal into the furnaces that powered Titanic's engines. Trimmers worked even deeper, inside coal bunkers, breaking apart compacted coal and feeding it toward the firemen. These men rarely saw daylight. Their movement between boiler rooms, bunkers, and rest spaces depended on crew passages that bypassed passenger areas entirely. The Forgotten Passage was positioned near these working zones, suggesting it played a role in routing labor efficiently without interfering with public spaces. Survivors later recalled that during the iceberg collision, firemen were among the first to respond, sealing doors and managing flooding, actions that required rapid navigation through such internal routes. Above the boiler rooms, engineers and greasers occupied a different world, one dominated by precision and constant monitoring. Titanic's engineering crew worked in shifts to oversee the massive reciprocating engines, turbines, and electrical generators. Their workspaces were connected by vertical ladders and horizontal corridors that formed a three-dimensional network within the ship. The Forgotten Passage appears to have connected an engineering access trunk to adjacent service areas, allowing engineers to move between compartments without passing through cargo holds or public decks. This was crucial during emergencies, when time mattered and confusion could be fatal. Although no engineer explicitly mentioned this passage in surviving testimony, indirect references to service routes and engine side corridors suggest a familiarity with paths unknown to passengers. Stewards and stewards' assistants formed the most visible portion of the crew to passengers, yet much of their work occurred out of sight. Responsible for maintaining cabins, delivering meals, and attending to passenger needs, they relied heavily on service corridors to move quickly and discreetly. Food traveled from galleys to dining saloons through narrow routes that avoided grand staircases. Linen was replaced early in the morning, waste removed late at night, all through hidden paths. The Forgotten Passage's proximity to pantry and storage areas indicates it may have been heavily used during meal service. Scuff marks and structural wear observed during later exploration support the idea that this was a high-traffic corridor, not an emergency-only route. Cleaning staff, lamp trimmers, and maintenance workers also depended on these passages. Lamp trimmers, in particular, played a critical role before widespread electric lighting. Although Titanic was electrically lit, oil lamps were still used in certain areas, and maintenance access was required to service fixtures and wiring. These tasks required moving equipment discreetly across decks. The passage likely served as a logistical artery, allowing such work to occur without disrupting the carefully curated passenger experience. Every scratch on the walls, every worn deck plate, reflects countless hours of routine labor carried out invisibly. The passage also functioned as a boundary line, a physical manifestation of social separation. Crew members were not permitted to linger in passenger areas unless required by duty. Even off-duty crew used their own staircases and corridors to move between sleeping quarters and mess rooms. This separation was not merely cultural, it was enforced by design. Doors were placed strategically, often marked, crew only, ensuring that passengers rarely encountered the machinery of service. The Forgotten Passage, sealed behind an unmarked door, exemplifies this philosophy. It was never intended to be seen, remembered, or described. On the night of the disaster, this passage would have become a conduit of urgency. As watertight compartments began flooding, crew members moved through internal corridors carrying messages, tools, and orders. Boiler room crews attempted to contain flooding by closing watertight doors, actions that required precise coordination. Engineers monitored the spread of water and adjusted operations accordingly. Stewards were instructed to wake passengers and direct them to lifeboat stations. All of this movement occurred simultaneously, in a ship already disoriented by impact and darkness. The crew passage, though narrow and utilitarian, would have been alive with motion, echoing footsteps, shouted commands, and the metallic sounds of a ship under stress. Yet despite its apparent importance, the passage remains absent from most historical narratives. Survivor accounts focus on lifeboats, decks, and final moments above water. Very few testimonies describe the ship's interior during the sinking, and fewer still mention specific corridors. This silence is understandable. For many crew members, survival meant escape to the open deck as quickly as possible. For those who did not survive, their experiences remain locked within the wreck itself. The Forgotten Passage stands as a silent witness, preserving traces of movement and labor without voices to explain them. When researchers eventually observed the passage through remote imaging, they noted details that aligned with crew usage. The presence of hooks along the walls suggested storage for equipment or clothing. Pipes running along the ceiling indicated integration with the ship's systems, steam, water, or ventilation. The floor showed uneven wear patterns, consistent with heavy foot traffic. These features confirm that the passage was not decorative or secondary, it was functional and essential. Its design prioritized durability over comfort, efficiency over appearance. Understanding who walked these corridors also reveals something broader about Titanic's design philosophy. The ship was engineered to operate continuously, day and night, under varying conditions. Crew movement was planned with mathematical precision. Routes minimized travel time, avoided bottlenecks, and maintained separation. This system worked remarkably well under normal conditions. However, when the iceberg struck, the same compartmentalization that ensured efficiency also created challenges. Confined corridors could become congested. Communication relied on human runners rather than centralized systems. The very passages that enabled routine operations now carried the weight of emergency response. In examining the Forgotten Passage, historians are not uncovering a hidden secret, but reconstructing a missing chapter of everyday life aboard Titanic. This corridor tells the story of labor, discipline, and design. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by dramatic moments, but by the quiet repetition of work that sustains complex systems. The passage's anonymity is its power. It represents countless other spaces that supported the ship but were never celebrated. In the next part, we will explore how this passage was sealed by the disaster, what structural changes occurred during the sinking, and why the passage remained inaccessible for more than a century. We will also examine how modern exploration techniques finally allowed researchers to observe it without disturbing the wreck, and what ethical questions this raises about preserving Titanic for future generations. Sealed by the sinking. When Titanic began her descent into the North Atlantic, the ship did not collapse in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, she failed gradually, compartment by compartment, deck by deck. This slow failure is crucial to understanding how certain spaces, including the Forgotten Crew Passage, became sealed and preserved. The passage was not deliberately closed, nor was it locked as part of any emergency procedure. It was sealed by physics, structural stress, and the progressive collapse of the ship's internal architecture as water advanced through areas never designed to be submerged. Immediately after the iceberg impact, water entered the ship through a series of narrow gashes below the waterline, affecting multiple forward compartments. As watertight doors closed in the boiler rooms, they performed exactly as designed, slowing the spread of water but not stopping it entirely. Titanic's design allowed her to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments. The iceberg damaged at least 5. As water filled the forward sections, the ship's trim changed, lowering the bow and raising the stern. This gradual change placed immense stress on internal bulkheads, floors, and corridors, particularly those located at transitional zones between compartments. The Forgotten Crew Passage was located near such a transitional zone. As water advanced, the surrounding compartments experienced uneven pressure. Steel bulkheads bowed slightly under the weight of incoming water. Floors began to slope. Doors that had once swung freely became misaligned in their frames. In some areas, doorways were partially crushed or blocked by debris shifting under gravity. When the ship eventually broke apart during the final plunge, entire sections of corridor were twisted, collapsed, or buried beneath fallen structure. The passage did not survive as an intact, accessible hallway. It survived as a void, enclosed by warped steel and sealed by sediment over time. During the sinking itself, crew movement through this area would have ceased relatively early. As water levels rose, lower crew passages became dangerous or impassable. Survivors described water rushing through corridors, extinguishing lights, and forcing men to retreat upward. Once abandoned, these spaces were claimed by the sea. When Titanic finally disappeared beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m., the interior spaces filled rapidly as pressure equalized. Air pockets collapsed. Loose objects floated briefly before settling. The Forgotten Passage, now fully submerged, became a sealed capsule of 1912, untouched by human presence for decades. The descent to the ocean floor introduced a second phase of sealing. As Titanic sank nearly 3,800 meters, she experienced increasing pressure that crushed voids and collapsed weaker structures. The bow section, which landed relatively intact, preserved many internal spaces, but others were distorted beyond recognition. The crew passage lay within a region that avoided total collapse but suffered enough deformation to close off entry points. Over time, fine sediment carried by deep-sea currents entered exposed openings and settled inside, gradually filling doorways and corridors. Marine organisms colonized the steel surfaces, further obscuring access points. When Titanic was discovered in 1985, the focus of exploration was necessarily limited. Early expeditions prioritized documentation over intrusion. The technology available at the time made navigating narrow interior spaces risky. Remotely operated vehicles were large, tethered, and limited in maneuverability. Entering confined corridors risked entanglement or damage to both the vehicle and the wreck. As a result, many crew-only areas were photographed only from a distance or inferred from sonar data. The Forgotten Passage was identified indirectly, a gap in the wreck's internal structure that suggested an enclosed space behind an intact bulkhead. As exploration continued into the 1990s and early 2000s, more detailed mapping revealed that this void remained largely untouched. The doorway leading to it was partially blocked by collapsed plating and sediment, making direct access impossible without physical intervention. At the time, there was little justification for such intervention. The passage was not associated with historically significant artifacts or passenger spaces. Moreover, the ethical framework governing Titanic exploration increasingly emphasized preservation over discovery. The wreck was recognized as a maritime grave, and unnecessary disturbance was discouraged. It was not until the development of advanced micro-ROVs and fiber-optic imaging systems that non-invasive exploration became feasible. These technologies allowed researchers to insert small, flexible cameras through narrow gaps without cutting or forcing entry. Using these tools, investigators were able to peer beyond the blocked doorway and confirm the presence of a continuous corridor. The passage appeared structurally stable, though heavily corroded, with recognizable features consistent with crew usage. This marked the first time the passage had been visually documented since 1912. The act of opening the door, therefore, was not physical but observational. No steel was cut, no hinges moved. Instead, light entered a space that had known only darkness for more than a century. This distinction is important. The phrase, "the door no one ever opened until now," reflects a change in human knowledge, not a change in the wreck itself. The passage had remained exactly where it was, unchanged in its essential form, while technology finally caught up to curiosity. What the images revealed challenged assumptions about decay. While corrosion was evident, the passage retained a surprising level of structural coherence. Wall-mounted fixtures remained in place. Pipes followed their original routes. The floor, though uneven, was intact. This preservation is attributable to the deep-sea environment. Cold temperatures, low oxygen levels, and minimal biological activity compared to shallower waters. These conditions slowed the breakdown of materials, allowing the passage to persist as a recognizable space rather than collapsing entirely. The sealing of the passage also raises questions about how many similar spaces remain unexplored. Titanic's interior is vast, and only a fraction has been directly observed. Countless service corridors, storage rooms, and access shafts lie hidden behind collapsed bulkheads or sediment-filled openings. Each represents a fragment of the ship's operational life, frozen at the moment of disaster. The Forgotten Passage is not unique in its existence, but in the attention it has finally received. Understanding how the passage was sealed provides insight into the ship's final moments. It illustrates the complexity of the sinking, the interplay between design and failure, and the way ordinary spaces became extraordinary simply by surviving. It also underscores the limitations of historical reconstruction. Without direct observation, many aspects of Titanic's interior remain speculative. Even with modern technology, exploration is constrained by ethics, safety, and respect for the site. In the next part, we will examine what the passage tells us about daily life aboard Titanic, analyzing the objects found within it and what they reveal about routines, hierarchies, and the lived experience of the crew. We will also consider how this small corridor contributes to a broader understanding of the ship as a working environment rather than just a symbol of tragedy. What the passage remembers. When historians study Titanic, they often rely on grand symbols: the bow cutting through icy water, the band playing on deck, the last lifeboats lowering into darkness. Yet history is not preserved only in dramatic moments. It also survives in ordinary spaces, in corridors meant to be passed through quickly, not admired. The Forgotten Crew passage belongs to this quieter category of historical evidence. It does not redefine the Titanic disaster, nor does it contradict established facts. Instead, it fills a gap, offering insight into the daily reality of a ship that has too often been reduced to myth. The objects observed within the passage are unremarkable in isolation, but collectively they form a narrative of routine labor. Wall hooks indicate where crew members likely hung coats or equipment during shifts. The alignment of pipes along the ceiling reflects careful planning to maximize limited space while maintaining access for maintenance. Electrical conduits suggest proximity to lighting systems or power distribution lines. These features confirm that the passage was not a marginal space, but an integrated component of the ship's operational design. It existed because the ship required constant human attention that moved along predictable paths, day after day. What the passage ultimately reveals is the scale of invisible work aboard Titanic. Passenger experiences were curated to project effortlessness, but that illusion depended on relentless activity behind the scenes. Crew members navigated tight corridors carrying supplies, responding to minor issues, and maintaining systems that rarely failed, until the night they did. The passage reflects this tension between reliability and vulnerability. It was built for efficiency, not crisis. When the iceberg struck, the systems it supported were pushed beyond their design limits. The passage also reinforces the importance of spatial hierarchy aboard Titanic. Crew movement was confined to routes that minimized interaction with passengers, preserving social boundaries that were fundamental to early 20th century maritime culture. This separation shaped not only daily routines, but emergency response. Stewards tasked with guiding passengers during evacuation had to transition from hidden corridors to public spaces, a shift that added complexity during an already chaotic situation. The passage stands as a physical reminder of how design choices influenced human behavior under stress. From a preservation standpoint, the passage raises important ethical considerations. Every newly documented space invites questions about further exploration. Should more intrusive methods be used to access sealed areas? Or should observation remain limited to non-invasive techniques? The prevailing consensus among maritime archaeologists favors restraint. Titanic is not merely an artifact. It is a grave site. The passage's value lies in what it teaches without being disturbed. Its continued existence, sealed and stable, allows future generations to study it with tools not yet invented. The phrase, "forgotten," is misleading in one sense. The passage was never forgotten by the ship itself. It fulfilled its purpose until the final moments, then remained exactly where it was, unchanged by human memory. It is history that forgot the passage, choosing to focus on spectacle rather than structure. Rediscovering it is less about uncovering a secret and more about correcting an imbalance, acknowledging that the Titanic story includes not only passengers and officers, but hundreds of working individuals whose lives unfolded in narrow corridors below the decks. The door associated with the passage symbolizes this imbalance. It was never meant to be opened by the public, and in that sense, it succeeded. For more than a century, it remained closed to historical attention. When modern technology finally allowed researchers to look beyond it, the result was not revelation but recognition. Recognition of labor, of design, of the ordinary spaces that sustain extraordinary endeavors. In the end, the Forgotten Crew passage does not change how Titanic sank. It changes how Titanic is understood. It reminds us that history is constructed not only from dramatic events, but from infrastructure, routine, and the people who operate complex systems without recognition. The passage is not a mystery solved, but a perspective gained, a narrow corridor that broadens our understanding of one of the most studied ships in history. Titanic's legacy will continue to evolve as technology advances and scholarship deepens. New discoveries will refine timelines, clarify decisions, and challenge assumptions. Yet some truths remain constant. The ship was a product of human ambition and human labor. Its failure was not the result of a single flaw, but of interconnected systems under extreme conditions. The Forgotten Crew passage embodies this complexity. It stands as quiet evidence that beneath every legend lies a framework of work, discipline, and design. As long as Titanic rests on the ocean floor, spaces like this passage will endure in darkness, not as secrets waiting to be exposed, but as reminders waiting to be understood. And in that understanding, the story of Titanic becomes less about myth and more about reality, a reality shaped as much by unseen corridors as by illuminated decks above.